The origin of the Aku family begins with the family patriarch, Reverend William Aku, a free African from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, born around 1809. William Aku was a free black man during an age when most Africans living in America were still toiling as slaves under oppressive conditions, working in the cotton, tobacco, and rice fields of the South, or working in the big house tending to every whim of their slave-holding masters and mistresses. During these arcane days, freedom was a precious commodity for any African American to possess, and every year thousands of enslaved men, women, and children risked their lives escaping bondage to attain that ultimate prize. Desperate, an estimated 50,000 slaves a year ran away in a dangerous attempt to gain their freedom. Fortunately, William Aku stood amongst that small, select class of blacks privileged enough to already have their freedom. Despite many inequalities, Philadelphia was the most promising city in the United States to raise an African family. At the time, the city of Philadelphia had the largest and wealthiest free African population in the United States. With an estimated population of 19,000, the African American community was strong and well established, with deep roots going back to colonial times. Black institutions had already been established in the city of Philadelphia by 1787, when the Free African Society, a mutual aid organization, was founded by Absalom Jones, Richard Allen, and several other like-minded black leaders. By 1792, Absalom Jones founded the first black Episcopalian congregation in the United States, the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas, opening its doors on July 17, 1794. Around this same time, Richard Allen, another prominent black Philadelphia leader, founded the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, affectionately known as Mother Bethel, in 1793, opening its doors on July 29, 1794. The Bethel AME Church grew exponentially, and by 1816, Richard Allen had spearheaded the formation of the first fully independent African-American religious denomination in the United States. This was significant because for the first time in history, African Americans declared their complete independence from white religious authority, not only being free in body, but emancipating their very souls. Those two original churches would become important for the descendants of William Aku, because members of the Aku family would become intimately involved with both religious institutions over a period spanning many generations, including as theologians. William Aku married Adeline Harris, and the couple were the first of a nucleus that would expand into a family of 8, forming a union that would embody the root of a lineage that would encompass 2 centuries, flourish in 3 major cities, and spawn 7 generations over 180 years. Even though the Aku family stood amongst a class of blacks privileged enough to already have freedom, their legal classification as free U.S. inhabitants did not make their lives that much easier. The Akus were still members of a group that ranked at the bottom of a society that was ruled by whites, and since their kind was either despised, barely tolerated, or simply ignored, the Akus had to create a life for themselves virtually out of nothing. Among their peers of darker hue in Philadelphia, the Akus' situation was typical. By 1830, all African Americans living in Philadelphia had free status. However, the city of brotherly love was no utopia. Economically, the masses of black residents received very low pay and meager wages, and struggled to survive from one day to the next. Despite the comfort of a fortunate few who were wealthy or successful, most free Africans were poor and struggling, and the vast majority lived in poverty on the small streets and alleys near the main thoroughfares. Many black residents in the city were newly freed or first-generation inhabitants, illiterate, and lacked limited opportunities for economic progress, typical of a marginalized group in a racially stratified society. For the young upstart Aku family, life was no different, and patriarch William Aku, like most free blacks in Philadelphia, worked as an unskilled or semi-skilled laborer, while his wife Adeline worked as a washwoman. These livelihoods were the lowest-level jobs available in the city, but the majority of Philadelphia's free black population worked in these bottom-tiered positions. William Aku's occupation was hard and thankless. Laborers cleaned the city's streets, dug ditches, hauled away trash, and in short, did whatever they could to eke out a living. Low-paid and physically very demanding, laboring also gave a man little job security, and he was usually hired by the day or by the week. His wife, Adlai Aku's job as a washwoman, was also unglamorous and low-paying, but it allowed her to work from home while caring for their young children. For men like William Aku, career advancement and job growth were severely limited. It was extremely difficult for a black man to obtain training in a skilled trade because tradesmen such as brick masons, carpenters, shoemakers, and machinists learned the art of their trades through the apprenticeship system, and most whites would not accept a black male as an apprentice. Even worse, many of the black men who had managed to learn a skilled trade could not find employment in their trained field because most whites were reluctant to hire them, which is highlighted by the fact that by 1854, less than two-thirds of black men in Philadelphia with skilled trades could find work in them. Even in the unskilled or semi-skilled job market that William Aku participated in, work could be scarce due to fierce competition with lower-class whites, specifically Irish Catholic immigrants, in which competing for available jobs often became dangerous and violent. From the city's beginnings until the 1830s, the lowest-paying unskilled jobs in Philadelphia were dominated by African Americans. However, with the large influx of an Irish immigrant population, Irish Catholics began to forcefully push African Americans out of the job market, and frequently fights ensued. Beginning in 1834, unemployed Irishmen rioted on the Schuylkill River attacking black dock workers, and they continued to assault black workers for days. Black longshoremen were also attacked, and locations where both blacks and whites looked for work often became the scene of violence perpetuated by ethnic Irishmen against employed or job-seeking blacks. Through aggressive labor tactics, violence, and growing numbers, the ethnic Irish eventually began to supplant blacks in the lower-level positions that they had previously dominated. Free black men were paying a price for their freedom because, unlike their enslaved brethren who were provided meager scraps of food and shelter by their masters, free blacks had to completely provide for themselves, a feat made increasingly more difficult by the prevalence of aggressive white immigrant competition. The negative and harsh environment of the job market was just the tip of the iceberg for William Aku, because he had to face down an even more menacing threat against his personal liberty, Philadelphia's institutionalized racism. In some ways, Philadelphia during the mid-19th century was strikingly like the Jim Crow South of the early 20th century. Institutional segregation was legalized, and black Philadelphians were relegated to second-class citizenship. For example, in 1838, Pennsylvania enacted a new state constitution that did not allow blacks to vote, which was particularly mean-spirited because black men in some parts of Pennsylvania had already been voting for years under the old constitution, and now they lost that right simply because of the color of their skin. In the city of brotherly love, white politicians worked to ensure that black Philadelphians continued to be denied their basic political rights. Democrats like Benjamin Martin and Charles Brown vehemently fought to keep black citizens restricted from voting by having it explicitly written in the state constitution. Democrats even went so far as to threaten black people with violence if they attempted to vote. Politician Benjamin Martin openly stated that
any attempt to amend the Constitution to place the black population on an equal footing with the white population would prove ruinous to the black people. Any attempt of the black population to exercise the right of suffrage would bring ruin upon their own heads.
Politician Charles Brown retorted the same type of inflammatory rhetoric, professing that
in 24 hours from the time that an attempt should be made by blacks to vote, not a Negro house in the city or county would be left standing.
Blacks like William Aku were not only denied suffrage, but they faced a spectrum of intolerance and racial prejudice that was broad and all-encompassing, stretching across many facets of society as race negatively impacted the public life of African Americans, affecting transportation, religion, education, and social mobility. The passionate criticism of renowned abolitionist and orator Frederick Douglass sums up best the toxic racial climate of mid-19th century Philadelphia when he states,
"There is not perhaps anywhere to be found a city which prejudice against color is more rampant than in Philadelphia. It has its white schools and its colored schools, its white churches and its colored churches, its white Christianity and its colored Christianity. The line is everywhere tightly drawn between them. Colored persons, no matter how well-dressed or how well-behaved ladies or gentlemen, rich or poor, are not even permitted to ride on any of the many railways through that Christian city. Halls are rented with the express understanding that no person of color shall be allowed to enter, either to attend a concert or listen to a lecture. The whole aspect of city usage at this point is mean, contemptible, and barbarous."
Unlike the Jim Crow South of the 20th century, a more peculiar, segregated dichotomy existed in 19th century Philadelphia, because despite its institutional and public segregation, most black residents still lived in the same neighborhoods as their white counterparts. In several instances, the Aku family lived on the same street as white families, and it was normal for African American families like the Akus to have white neighbors of all classes. Certainly, there were areas with higher concentrations of African Americans, like on Lombard Street and South Street, but there was not a truly separate neighborhood dividing the races. This was a dysfunctional kind of segregation where blacks and whites lived in integrated neighborhoods and were sometimes even next-door neighbors, but lived in a city that imposed a strong discriminatory and institutionalized segregated public life. In 1841, William Aku and his wife Adeline had a daughter named Anne Maria Aku. Baby Anne Maria was born into a city that was wrought with intense violence and hatred, where black Philadelphians faced frequent outbreaks of racially motivated attacks and riots. The negative racial climate was so obvious that internationally traveled English abolitionist Joseph Sturge reported disparagingly about the city's racial problems in his work, A Visit to the United States in 1841, where he asserts,
"Philadelphia appears to be the metropolis of this odious prejudice, and there is probably no city in the known world where dislike amounting to hatred of the colored population prevails more than in the city of brotherly love."
This sentiment was substantiated the following year in 1842. That summer, the divisive racial climate culminated into a major disaster, the race riot of 1842, also known as the Lombard Street riots. On August 1st, 1842, an Irish mob attacked an African American parade celebrating the anniversary of the abolition of slavery in the West Indies. At first, the violence was mostly directed by the white mob against the African American parade marchers, but then it escalated, and whites began an all-out destructive and violent rampage against the proud black community. Racist thugs terrorized African Americans in their own neighborhood, even violently beating women and children and looting African American homes. This rampage lasted overnight and well into the next day. Whites continued to riot, destroying homes and public buildings, and completely burned down the Second Colored Presbyterian Church and Smith's Beneficial Hall, an abolitionist meeting place. The attacks and rioting lasted 3 days and was centered between 5th and 8th Streets on Lombard, right at the heart of black institutions and its social life. Despite all the racial turmoil, economic, political, and social discrimination, William Aku still found the wherewithal to successfully establish a family, fathering at least 6 children. William's perseverance would not be in vain. He would provide the foundation for offspring and descendants who would rise to help steer the winds of change in America. His descendants would be responsible for pioneering an incomprehensible array of black historical milestones that would not only advance black society, but would affect American society in a permanent way. Please watch the next video for Episode 2, The Rise of the Aku Family.